What if I told you that the most powerful empire in the ancient world once stood at the gates of total domination and simply walked away? That the legions who had conquered Gaul, crushed Carthage, and brought kings to their knees were ordered to stop, to turn back, to choose restraint over glory. This isn't a story about defeat. This is about something far more extraordinary, something that would echo through the centuries and reshape what it meant to be Roman. The campfires stretched across the Germanic forests like fallen stars, thousands upon thousands of flames flickering in the darkness beyond the Rhine. Roman soldiers huddled close to the warmth, their breath forming clouds in the bitter cold, their armor dulled by mud and rain. These were the legions of Augustus, the finest fighting force the world had ever known, and they had come to the edge of the known world. Beyond the river lay mysteries and peoples who had never bent the knee to Rome, tribes whose warriors painted their faces and sang songs of ancient gods that predated Jupiter himself. The legionaries could hear them sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, the barbarian drums beating a rhythm that seemed to come from the earth itself. Commander Drusus stood at the riverbank, watching the dark waters of the Rhine flow southward, carrying with it branches and debris from the wild forests beyond. He was young for his rank, brother to the future Emperor Tiberius, stepson to Augustus himself, and he burned with the kind of ambition that had built empires. His campaigns had pushed Roman power deeper into Germania than ever before, crossing rivers that Roman poets said marked the boundaries of civilization. His legions had erected forts in lands where Latin had never been spoken, where the ground itself seemed hostile to Mediterranean order. Every victory brought Rome closer to a dream that had obsessed generals since the time of Julius Caesar, the dream of a Germania Romana that would stretch from the Rhine to the Elbe, perhaps even to the distant Baltic Sea that traders spoke of in whispered tones. But Drusus would never see that dream fulfilled. On a grey autumn day, as his horse stumbled on unfamiliar ground, he fell, and the injury that seemed minor at first began to fester. Within weeks, the commander who had seemed destined to match Alexander's glory was dead, carried back to Rome on the shields of his weeping soldiers. The legions mourned him as they had mourned few generals before, painting his name on their standards, swearing oaths to continue his work. In Rome, Augustus received the news in his private chambers, and those who saw him said his face became like marble, unmoving and cold. He had lost his nephew, his adopted son, a young man he had groomed for greatness. But he had also lost something else, a vision of endless expansion that had driven Roman policy for generations. The forests of Germania were unlike anything the Romans had encountered before. In Gaul, there had been cities to capture, chieftains to negotiate with, a structure of power that could be co-opted or crushed and replaced. In Hispania, there were resources to extract, silver mines and fertile valleys that justified the cost in blood and gold. But Germania was different. It was a landscape of endless trees, of swamps that swallowed cohorts whole, of tribes that melted into the wilderness when legions approached and reappeared like wolves when the Romans made camp. The soldiers told stories around their fires, stories that would have seemed like madness to citizens safe in Rome. They spoke of forests so dense that daylight never reached the ground, of trees so ancient they had witnessed the birth of civilization. They spoke of warriors who fought naked in the freezing cold, who seemed to feel no pain, who believed that dying in battle guaranteed them a place in some savage paradise beyond the stars. Roman engineers, those masters of roads and aqueducts who had tamed the Mediterranean world, found themselves defeated by the terrain. Roads that took months to build disappeared into mud within weeks. Bridges collapsed under the weight of supply wagons. Forts built with Roman precision were abandoned when maintaining them proved impossible. The Germanic tribes learned quickly that they didn't need to defeat Rome in open battle. They simply needed to wait, to harass, to make every mile of Roman advance cost dearly in lives and resources. The forests themselves seemed to fight against the legions, branches tearing at standards, roots tripping cavalry, darkness hiding enemies until they were upon you. Augustus sat in his palace on the Palatine Hill, surrounded by maps that represented decades of conquest. The empire stretched from Britannia to the deserts of Africa, from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. It was the largest continuous empire the world had ever known, and maintaining it consumed every waking moment of his reign. The logistics alone were staggering. Grain ships from Egypt fed the mob of Rome. Silver from Hispania paid the legions. Roads built at enormous cost connected cities that still remembered when they were independent kingdoms. Governors in distant provinces wielded power that would have made them kings in earlier eras, and keeping them loyal required constant vigilance, careful balancing of reward and threat. The emperor was growing old. The young Octavian who had fought for power in the civil wars was gone, replaced by a man who understood that empire was not about glory, but about administration, not about conquest, but about stability. He had learned lessons that his great-uncle Julius Caesar had never lived long enough to fully grasp. Expansion was intoxicating. The thrill of new territories appearing on maps, of tribes submitting to Roman authority, of generals returning with trains of captives and wagons full of plunder. But expansion had costs that weren't counted in the triumph parades. Every new province required garrisons, permanent legionary camps that pulled young men from Italian farms and turned them into career soldiers who knew nothing but military life. Every new territory needed governors, administrators, tax collectors, the entire machinery of Roman bureaucracy replicated again and again across landscapes that had never known such systems. The Rhine and the Danube had been Rome's natural boundaries for decades, great rivers that were easy to defend, easy to supply along, natural divides between civilization and barbarism. Drusus had pushed beyond the Rhine, and his successor Tiberius had achieved remarkable victories, but at what cost? The campaigns in Germania consumed legions, not in great battles that could be commemorated in stone and song, but in slow attrition, in small skirmishes and diseases, and soldiers who simply disappeared into the forest and were never seen again. The tribes beyond the Rhine had little wealth worth plundering. They lived in wooden halls, wore simple clothes, had no cities to ransom, no treasuries to empty. Conquering them would be purely a matter of prestige, of fulfilling the Roman ideology that demanded constant expansion, that saw peace as merely preparation for the next war. In the Senate, debates raged about the future of Germanic policy. The hawks, mostly younger senators and those with military backgrounds, argued passionately for continued expansion. They invoked the memory of Drusus, claiming that abandoning his conquests would dishonor his sacrifice. They spoke of Roman destiny, of bringing civilization to the barbarians, of creating a Germania that would one day have aqueducts and amphitheaters, where Latin would be spoken and Roman law would govern. They warned of the danger of leaving hostile tribes on Rome's borders, tribes that could one day threaten the empire if left unchecked. They appealed to Roman pride, asking whether the descendants of Scipio and Pompey would retreat from mere forests and savages. But other voices spoke as well. The pragmatists, older senators who remembered the civil wars and understood the fragility of peace, questioned what Germania offered that justified the cost. They pointed to the staggering expense of maintaining legions in hostile territory, of building infrastructure that the terrain seemed determined to destroy, of garrison duty that destroyed morale and created legions that were more barbarian than Roman after years in the wilderness. They spoke of the dangers of overextension, of how Rome's power came not from its size, but from its cohesion, its ability to defend what it held, its systems of roads and trade that connected the empire into a unified whole. Adding vast tracts of unconquerable forest would not make Rome stronger, it would make Rome vulnerable. Augustus listened to these debates, but his mind had already moved beyond them. He was thinking in terms that few of his contemporaries could grasp, thinking not in terms of years, but in terms of generations. Not about the glory of conquest, but about the survival of the system he had created. The Roman Republic had died in civil war, torn apart by generals who commanded legions loyal to them personally rather than to Rome itself. Augustus had ended those wars and created something new, a principate that maintained the forms of the Republic while concentrating real power in his hands. But this system was fragile, dependent on the authority and skill of whoever held supreme power. What would happen when Augustus was gone? Would his successors be capable of managing an ever-expanding empire? Or would the strains of constant warfare and the ambitions of frontier generals tear everything apart again? The emperor had already suffered personal tragedies that suggested the gods were warning him against hubris. Drusus was dead. His own daughter Julia had been exiled for behavior that scandalized conservative Rome, a reminder that even the imperial family was not immune to the chaos that threatened to overwhelm order. His grandsons, intended heirs, were dying young or proving unsuitable for power. The future of Rome seemed increasingly uncertain, and adding massive new territories that required constant military attention seemed like madness when the succession itself was in doubt. Then came the news that changed everything. In the Teutoburg forest, deep in Germania, 3 entire legions had been destroyed, not defeated in battle and allowed to retreat, not captured and held for ransom. Destroyed, annihilated, erased from existence. Commander Varus, a trusted administrator whom Augustus had appointed to govern the supposedly pacified Germanic territories, had led his legions into a trap that became a massacre lasting for days. Germanic tribes under the leadership of Arminius, a warrior who had served in the Roman auxiliary forces and learned Roman tactics, had lured the legions into the forest and slaughtered them. More than 20,000 Roman soldiers died in the mud and rain, their standards captured, their eagle emblems carried off as trophies by barbarians who danced around fires in celebration. When the news reached Rome, it struck like a thunderbolt. The city that had not known true military disaster in generations was suddenly confronted with the reality that its legions were not invincible, that Roman military science and discipline could be overcome by barbarians using the terrain to their advantage. Augustus was seen walking the halls of his palace at night, beating his head against the walls and crying out the name of Varus, demanding that the dead general return his legions. The proud city that had conquered the Mediterranean world was forced to confront a humiliating truth. There were limits to Roman power, places where the legions could not go, peoples who could not be conquered, no matter how many soldiers Rome sent against them. The psychological impact of Teutoburg cannot be overstated. For generations, Romans had believed in their manifest destiny to rule the world, to bring order and civilization to all peoples. The defeat shattered this certainty. It forced Romans to ask uncomfortable questions. What was the point of endless expansion if it led to such catastrophes? How many legions would be needed to truly conquer Germania? And what would be left of Rome itself if those legions were committed to a war of attrition in hostile terrain? Could the empire survive another Teutoburg, or had Rome reached the limits of what was possible? In the aftermath of the disaster, Augustus made a decision that would define his legacy as much as any of his victories. He called back the legions. He ordered the abandonment of forward positions beyond the Rhine. He declared that the Rhine and Danube would be Rome's permanent northern boundaries, not temporary stopping points, but the actual limits of Roman territory. He instructed his generals to focus on fortifying these frontiers, building permanent installations that would make crossing the rivers nearly impossible for hostile forces. The era of unlimited expansion was over. Rome would consolidate, defend, and perfect what it already held, rather than eternally grasping for more. This decision was revolutionary. For the first time in Roman memory, the empire was choosing to stop expanding, not because it had been defeated militarily, but because expansion itself no longer served Roman interests. The Senate was divided. Some hailed Augustus as a wise leader who had saved Rome from exhausting itself in unwinnable wars. Others muttered that Rome had grown soft, that the warrior spirit that had built the empire was being sacrificed to bureaucratic caution. In the army camps, reactions were mixed. Some soldiers were relieved to be pulled back from the nightmarish forests of Germania. Others felt betrayed, as if their sacrifices had been rendered meaningless by this strategic retreat. But Augustus was not simply retreating. He was reimagining what Rome could be. Instead of an empire constantly at war, constantly expanding, constantly consuming resources in pursuit of new conquests, he envisioned an empire at peace, focusing its energies on internal development, on building roads and cities, on spreading Roman culture and law to the provinces not through force, but through the attractive power of civilization itself. The Rhine frontier became a showcase for this new vision. Massive fortifications were erected, permanent stone fortresses that housed entire legions. These weren't temporary camps, but cities unto themselves, with bathhouses and temples and markets, places where soldiers could spend their entire careers, where they could marry local women and raise families, where the line between soldier and civilian, between Roman and provincial, began to blur. The frontier became a zone of interaction rather than simply a line of defense. Trade flourished across the rivers. Germanic tribes that remained independent found it profitable to trade with Rome rather than raid it. Roman merchants traveled into Barbaricum with goods that the tribes desired, glass and wine and metalwork of a quality they couldn't produce themselves. In return, Rome received furs and amber and slaves, but also something less tangible, intelligence about what was happening beyond the frontier, early warning of tribal movements and conflicts that might eventually impact Roman security. The frontier became permeable in controlled ways, with certain tribes allowed to cross for markets and festivals, with Germanic warriors recruited into Roman auxiliary units where they learned Roman methods and developed loyalty to the empire that paid them. This was a fundamentally different approach to empire than anything Rome had previously attempted. Previous generations had believed that security came from conquest, that the only way to protect Roman territory was to expand it, to create buffer zones of subjugated peoples who absorbed the first shock of any invasion. Augustus was proposing something different, that security could come from stable, well-defended boundaries, from systems of fortification and patrol that made invasion prohibitively difficult, from diplomatic relationships with peoples beyond the frontier that gave them reasons to maintain peace. It was an approach that required patience and long-term thinking, qualities that were not traditionally associated with Roman military culture. The economic implications were profound. The endless campaigns in Germania had consumed vast amounts of wealth. Legions needed to be paid, supplied, reinforced. Roads and bridges had to be built and maintained in hostile territory. Officers required bribes and bonuses to maintain morale. The plunder from Germania had never been sufficient to offset these costs. By ending the campaigns, Augustus freed up resources that could be invested elsewhere. Roads in Gaul and Hispania that had been neglected while the empire focused on Germania could now be completed. Cities in the eastern provinces that had been waiting for imperial patronage could receive it. The grain supply that fed Rome could be secured and expanded. The economy, which had been distorted by decades of military spending on a single frontier, could rebalance and grow. The cultural impact was equally significant. Roman literature and art of the Augustan age had been obsessed with military glory, with epic poems celebrating conquest and victory. The decision to stop expanding forced a cultural reckoning. What did it mean to be Roman if Rome was no longer conquering? How could Roman identity be maintained if it wasn't defined by military expansion? Augustus encouraged a shift toward celebrating peace, toward glorifying the achievements of civilization rather than the achievements of war. The Ara Pacis, the altar of peace, was constructed as a monument to this new ideology, its marble friezes depicting not battle scenes, but peaceful processions, agricultural abundance, the blessings of stable government. Poets like Virgil were encouraged to write epics that celebrated Roman civilization and destiny in terms that went beyond simple military conquest. Yet the decision remained controversial throughout Augustus's remaining years. Every time a Germanic tribe raided across the Rhine, every time there was a skirmish on the frontier, voices in Rome questioned whether the withdrawal had been wise. Shouldn't Rome punish these outrages? Shouldn't the legions cross the river and teach the barbarians a lesson? Augustus resisted these calls, understanding that retaliation would inevitably lead to escalation, that temporary punitive expeditions would become permanent occupations, that Rome would find itself drawn back into the quagmire it had escaped. The frontier must hold, he insisted. The rivers must remain the boundaries. Roman security depended on this discipline. The emperor knew that his decision would truly be tested only after his death. Would his successors maintain the policy, or would they, driven by ambition or pressure from the military, resume the expansionist wars? Augustus did everything he could to institutionalize his approach. He wrote detailed instructions, a document known as the Res Gestae that recorded his achievements and implicitly argued for continuation of his policies. He chose Tiberius as his successor specifically because Tiberius understood the reasoning behind the defensive strategy, having personally commanded legions in Germania and witnessed the difficulties firsthand. He organized the frontier defenses so thoroughly that any attempt to change the policy would require dismantling an entire system of fortifications and deployments. When Augustus finally died, peacefully in his bed at an advanced age, the question of the frontier became one of the defining issues of the new reign. Tiberius maintained his predecessor's policy, resisting calls for new Germanic campaigns, even when it made him unpopular with the army and the Senate. But the temptation to expand was always there, lurking in the background of Roman politics. Some of Tiberius's successors would give in to that temptation, launching campaigns beyond the Rhine that achieved temporary victories but never led to permanent conquest. Each time, the same pattern repeated. Initial success, difficult occupation, mounting costs, eventual withdrawal. The lesson of Augustus was relearned again and again. Germania could not be held. The Rhine-Danube frontier that Augustus established lasted for centuries. It became one of the most heavily fortified borders in the ancient world, a line of defense that marked the limits of Mediterranean civilization. The provinces behind the frontier flourished in peace, becoming some of the most prosperous and Romanized parts of the empire. Cities grew, trade networks expanded, Latin became the language of commerce and culture. The frontier itself became a unique cultural zone, where Roman and Germanic influences blended, where soldiers who had come from Italy or Africa settled down with local women and created hybrid communities that were neither fully Roman nor fully barbarian, but something new. But the significance of Augustus's decision went beyond military strategy or economics. It represented a fundamental reimagining of what empire meant. For generations, empires had been understood as inherently expansionist. An empire that wasn't growing was dying, or so the conventional wisdom held. Augustus challenged this assumption. He proposed that an empire could reach a point of optimal size, that there could be such a thing as enough, that the purpose of power was not endless accumulation, but the creation and maintenance of stable, prosperous systems of governance. This was a radical idea, one that went against the grain of nearly all imperial thinking up to that point. The decision also revealed something profound about the nature of power itself. True power, Augustus understood, lay not in the ability to conquer, but in the ability to choose restraint. Any general can order his legions forward. Only a truly secure leader can order them to stop. The young Octavian, who had fought his way to power through civil war, would never have made such a decision. He would have seen it as weakness, as a betrayal of Roman destiny. But the aged Augustus, who had held power for decades and understood its complexities, recognized that sometimes the most difficult and most important choice is to not act, to resist the siren call of glory and make the harder choice of prudent limitation. The legionaries stationed along the Rhine lived with this decision every day. They manned watchtowers that overlooked the forests of Germania, knowing that they were guarding not just a border, but a principle. Behind them lay the empire, with its roads and cities and law, the accumulated achievements of centuries of civilization. Before them lay the wilderness, free but chaotic, unconquered but also undeveloped. They were the line between these two worlds, and they understood that their job was not to expand one into the other, but to maintain the separation, to allow each side to develop according to its own nature. Some of them dreamed of glory, of campaigns that would take them deep into Germania as heroes. But most came to understand and even appreciate the strange peace of the frontier, where enemies could become trading partners, where war was always possible but rarely necessary. Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine developed complex relationships with Rome. Some remained hostile, nursing grievances and planning revenge for relatives killed in earlier wars. But many came to see Rome not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a powerful neighbor to be dealt with pragmatically. They sent their sons to serve in Roman auxiliary units, where they learned Latin and Roman tactics, and sometimes rose to positions of authority. They traded for Roman goods, and Germanic warriors began to carry Roman swords, wear Roman armor, and even speak broken Latin. In some cases, entire tribes relocated to the Roman side of the Rhine, accepting imperial authority in exchange for land and protection. The frontier became less a wall and more a membrane, separating but also connecting two worlds. Roman soldiers who spent years on the frontier often developed surprising perspectives. Living so close to the barbarians, interacting with them in trade and occasional diplomacy, some began to see them not as subhuman enemies, but as simply different peoples with their own cultures and values. They learned Germanic languages, participated in local festivals, formed friendships and even relationships that crossed the cultural divide. When these soldiers returned to Rome, they brought with them a more nuanced understanding of the peoples beyond the frontier, one that challenged the simplistic narratives of Roman superiority that dominated metropolitan discourse. This cultural exchange, facilitated by the stable frontier that Augustus had established, was one of the unexpected benefits of choosing peace over expansion. The infrastructure of the frontier was extraordinary. The limes, as Romans called it, consisted not just of forts, but of an entire integrated defensive system. Watchtowers were positioned within sight of each other, allowing signals to be relayed rapidly along the entire length of the frontier. Roads ran parallel to the rivers, enabling rapid movement of reinforcements to any threatened point. Supply depots ensured that the frontier garrison could hold out even if temporarily cut off from the interior. Naval patrols on the rivers prevented unauthorized crossings. This was military engineering on a scale that would not be matched for more than a millennium, a testament to Roman organizational skill and to Augustus's commitment to making the frontier impregnable. The civilian population that grew up around the military installations transformed the frontier from a temporary military zone into permanent settlements. Merchants set up shops to supply the soldiers. Craftsmen came to repair equipment and make goods for sale. Families of soldiers settled nearby, creating communities that served the garrison. Over time, these settlements grew into towns, some of which eventually received charters as Roman municipalities with their own local governments and privileges. The frontier became populated, civilized, a buffer zone that was neither fully military nor fully civilian, but a unique blend of both. This organic development would have been impossible if Rome had continued trying to push deeper into Germania. The instability of constant campaigning would have prevented the establishment of permanent civilian communities. Agricultural development followed military security. As the frontier stabilized, farmers began cultivating lands that had been too dangerous during the years of conflict. River valleys behind the fortifications became agricultural zones, producing grain and wine for the army and for export to other parts of the empire. The provinces of Gaul and Raetia, which bordered Germania, transformed from war zones into productive territories that contributed significantly to imperial prosperity. This economic development created stakeholders in the frontier system, people whose livelihoods depended on maintaining peace, creating a constituency for Augustus's defensive strategy that went beyond the military. The educational impact of the frontier should not be underestimated. The presence of literate soldiers and administrators brought Roman education to regions that had never known it. Schools were established in frontier towns, teaching Latin and Greek, arithmetic and rhetoric, preparing local youth for positions in the imperial bureaucracy or the army. Sons of Germanic chieftains who allied with Rome were sometimes sent to receive Roman educations, returning to their tribes with an understanding of Roman culture and methods. This soft power, the gradual spread of Roman civilization through education and cultural appeal, proved more effective at binding peoples to the empire than military conquest ever could have been. Religious syncretism flourished along the frontier. Roman soldiers worshipped their traditional gods, building temples to Jupiter and Mars, maintaining the sacred rituals of the legion. But they also encountered Germanic religious practices, and in many cases adopted them, worshipping local deities alongside Roman ones, or identifying Germanic gods with Roman equivalents. This religious blending created a unique frontier spirituality that was neither purely Roman nor purely Germanic, but something hybrid and new. The tolerance implicit in this syncretism, the acceptance that different peoples could worship different gods without threatening social order, was another aspect of the peaceful coexistence that Augustus's frontier policy made possible. Military innovation continued along the frontier despite the end of major offensive campaigns. Roman engineers developed new fortification techniques, learned from the challenges of defending river boundaries. Tactics evolved to deal with the specific threats posed by Germanic warriors, emphasizing rapid response and coordinated defense rather than the large-scale set-piece battles that characterized Mediterranean warfare. The auxiliary units, recruited from provincial and even Germanic populations, became an increasingly important part of Roman military strength, valued for their specialized skills and local knowledge. The army that defended the Augustan frontier was more diverse, more flexible, and in many ways more effective than the legions that had conquered Gaul. The frontier also became a source of intelligence about the world beyond Roman control. Merchants and scouts gathered information about Germanic tribal politics, about migrations and conflicts happening far beyond the Rhine. This intelligence network gave Rome early warning of potential threats, allowing preemptive diplomatic interventions that prevented problems from developing into military crises. Roman agents sometimes intervened in Germanic politics, supporting factions friendly to Rome or working to prevent the formation of large tribal coalitions that might threaten the frontier. This active diplomacy, backed by the implicit threat of military intervention, but rarely requiring it, was another tool that made Augustus's defensive strategy viable. The economic system that developed along the frontier created mutual dependencies that reinforced peace. Germanic tribes became reliant on Roman trade goods, on iron tools and pottery and luxuries that their own economies couldn't produce. Roman border provinces became reliant on Germanic labor and resources, on the furs and amber and livestock that came across the frontier. These economic ties meant that disrupting the peace carried real costs for both sides, creating incentives to resolve disputes through negotiation rather than warfare. The market day, when Germanic traders crossed the river under Roman supervision to exchange goods, became a ritual of peace, a regular reminder that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. As decades passed after Augustus's death, his frontier policy became increasingly normalized. What had initially seemed like a controversial retreat came to be seen as simple, prudent governance. New generations of Romans grew up in a world where the Rhine-Danube line was simply the natural boundary of the empire, where expansion beyond it was seen as a risky adventure rather than a natural destiny. The ideology of manifest destiny that had driven earlier expansion was gradually replaced by an ideology of perfection. The idea that Rome's task was not to rule all lands, but to perfect its governance of the lands it already held, to make every province prosper, every city beautiful, every subject secure in Roman law. This ideological shift was reinforced by developments in other parts of the empire. In Britannia, Rome conquered the southern portion of the island, but never managed to subdue the highlands, eventually building Hadrian's Wall to mark the limits of Roman control. In the east, repeated conflicts with Parthia and later Persia demonstrated the costs of trying to expand in that direction. In Africa, the Sahara provided a natural boundary beyond which expansion made no sense. Gradually, the entire empire came to accept that there were natural limits to Roman power, that certain boundaries made sense both geographically and strategically. Augustus's decision regarding Germania had established a precedent that applied elsewhere, the recognition that choosing where not to expand could be as important as choosing where to conquer. The legal developments that flowed from frontier stability were significant. As provinces settled into peace and prosperity, Roman law spread and adapted to local conditions. Local legal traditions blended with Roman legal principles, creating hybrid systems that worked better than simple imposition of Mediterranean law would have. The development of Roman jurisprudence, which would eventually become one of Rome's greatest legacies to Western civilization, happened largely during this period of consolidation, as jurists and administrators worked out how to govern a vast and diverse empire fairly and efficiently. This legal sophistication would have been much more difficult to achieve in an empire constantly disrupted by wars of expansion. The arts flourished in the peace that Augustus's policies created. The generation after Augustus produced some of Rome's greatest literature, as writers no longer needed to focus on celebrating military conquest and could explore more subtle themes of human nature, morality, and the challenges of maintaining civilization. Architecture became increasingly sophisticated as resources that might have been consumed in military campaigns were instead invested in public buildings, temples, forums, and infrastructure that beautified cities throughout the empire. The visual arts produced works of stunning quality, portraits and sculptures that captured the confidence and stability of an empire at peace with itself. Medicine and science advanced in this environment of stability. Doctors serving with frontier garrisons made discoveries about treating wounds and diseases, knowledge that spread throughout the empire. Engineers working on aqueducts and roads developed techniques that enabled construction projects of unprecedented scale. Agricultural innovations spread as farmers had the security to experiment with new crops and methods. The general increase in prosperity meant that more people had the leisure and resources to pursue learning, leading to a broader distribution of education and a flourishing of intellectual life in provincial cities as well as in Rome itself. The demographic impact of the frontier policy was profound. Instead of losing young men to endless campaigns in Germania, Italian and provincial families kept their sons, who contributed to local economies and communities. The birth rate stabilized, and in some areas increased, as the security of the frontier gave people confidence in the future. Population growth in the frontier provinces was particularly notable, as the combination of military security and economic opportunity drew migrants from elsewhere in the empire. These population dynamics strengthened the empire, creating a larger tax base and military recruitment pool that made Rome more resilient to the challenges it would face in later centuries. Social mobility increased along the frontier. A soldier from Hispania could serve on the Rhine, marry a local woman, retire with a land grant, and see his sons become Roman citizens with opportunities throughout the empire. A merchant from Syria could trade along the frontier, accumulate wealth, and purchase status for his family. This fluidity, this sense that origin mattered less than achievement and loyalty, strengthened the bonds that held the empire together. It was easier to maintain this mobility in a stable empire than in one constantly consuming resources in wars of expansion that benefited only a few at the top. The environmental impact of choosing stability over expansion deserves consideration. The forests of Germania remained largely intact beyond the Rhine, continuing to serve as habitats and resources for the peoples who lived there. The Rhine itself remained relatively unpolluted compared to what might have happened with intensive Roman development. The choice not to conquer allowed for a different kind of relationship with the environment, one where Roman influence reached across the frontier through trade and cultural exchange rather than through exploitation and deforestation. This wasn't environmentalism in any modern sense, but it did result in a less destructive relationship with frontier lands than total conquest would have created. Germanic society beyond the frontier evolved in response to Roman proximity. Tribes that might have remained small and politically fragmented began to form larger coalitions, partly in response to the Roman threat, but also partly in imitation of Roman organizational methods. Germanic warriors, who served in Roman auxiliary units, brought back military techniques and organizational concepts that transformed tribal warfare. Trade with Rome introduced new technologies and goods that changed Germanic material culture. In a sense, Rome was civilizing Germania not through conquest, but through influence, achieving by example and interaction what it had failed to achieve through military force. The philosophical implications of Augustus's decision have resonated through the centuries. The idea that power should be limited, that there can be such a thing as enough, that restraint is a virtue rather than a weakness. These concepts challenged the unlimited ambition that had characterized earlier imperial thinking. Later political theorists would look back to Augustus's frontier policy as an example of wise governance, of a leader who understood that the purpose of power was not self-aggrandizement, but the welfare of the people governed. The decision planted seeds of thought about limited government and the responsibilities of power that would eventually flower in later political philosophy. Yet the decision was never final or irreversible. Every generation of Roman leaders faced the temptation to resume expansion into Germania, to finish what Augustus had left undone. Some succumbed to that temptation, launching campaigns that achieved temporary successes, but never permanent results. The pattern established in Augustus's time repeated itself, demonstrating that he had been correct about the fundamental strategic reality. Germania could be raided, but not held, influenced but not conquered, respected but not subdued. Each failed attempt at renewed expansion vindicated Augustus's judgment and reinforced the wisdom of accepting natural limits to imperial power. The frontier lasted, with modifications and occasional disruptions, for approximately 4 centuries after Augustus established it. That extraordinary longevity testified to the soundness of his strategic vision. The empire that emerged from his reforms was fundamentally different from the constantly expanding republic that had preceded it. It was more stable, more prosperous, more culturally sophisticated, and ultimately more durable. The transition from conquest to consolidation, from republic to empire, from unlimited ambition to prudent limitation, these transformations were all bound up with the decision to stop at the Rhine and Danube and declare that Rome had reached its natural limits. When barbarian invasions eventually did overwhelm Roman defenses in the west, it happened not because Augustus had been wrong to establish the frontier, but because later leaders lacked the resources and will to maintain it. The defensive system he had created could work only if properly manned and supplied, only if the empire behind it remained strong and unified. As internal divisions weakened Rome, as economic problems undermined the tax base, as political instability led to civil wars, the frontier became indefensible not because of any flaw in its design, but because the empire lacked the strength to maintain it. The blame lay not with the boundary itself, but with the failure to preserve the stable governance that made defending it possible. The memory of the Teutoburg disaster lingered in Roman consciousness as a warning against hubris. Every schoolboy learned of Varus and the lost legions, of the dangers of underestimating enemies and overextending power. The story became a cautionary tale about the limits of military might, about the dangers of fighting on terrain that favored the enemy, about the importance of respecting the judgments of experience. In this sense, the defeat was transmuted into wisdom, the terrible cost justified if it prevented future generations from repeating the mistake. The soldiers who stood watch along the Rhine in the generations after Augustus were, in their own way, more important to Rome than the heroes who had conquered Gaul or defeated Carthage. They performed the harder duty of maintaining what had been won rather than seeking new glories. They lived routine lives of patrol and construction, broken occasionally by brief alarms and minor skirmishes, never experiencing the dramatic victories that made reputations. Yet their steady, unglamorous service made possible everything that happened behind them, all the prosperity and culture and development that flourished in the peaceful provinces. They were the guardians of civilization, standing between order and chaos, and they fulfilled that role precisely because Augustus had given them a clear mission and the resources to accomplish it. The great irony is that Augustus is remembered as much for his conquests as for his restraint. The Temple of Janus in Rome, whose doors were closed only when the empire was at peace, was closed during his reign, an achievement that previous generations had only dreamed of. He had defeated the enemies of Rome, expanded its boundaries to natural frontiers, and then, most remarkably, declared that the expansion was complete. This combination of martial success and peaceful consolidation gave his reign a completeness, a sense of having